So we're going to look at Buddhism. What does Buddhism have to say about gene therapy and genetic engineering? The good thing about Buddhism is you can break everything down with numbers. So there are 3 jewels, 4 noble truths, 5 precepts, and the 8-fold path. Now, the 3 jewels, the second of which, of course, is the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha. Now, the 4 noble truths are his main teaching, and the first of these is that dukkha exists, suffering exists, okay? In the 5 precepts, the first 2 of the 5 precepts are, I abstain from killing. This is the principle of ahimsa. And the second one is, I abstain from taking what is not given. We can apply these 2 teachings into the theories of gene therapy and genetic engineering. And then of course you have the 8-fold path. And in the 8-fold path you find right action and right livelihood. So if anything in our course of study, in a course of research on gene therapy and genetic engineering goes against these things, then we can conclude that they are going against the teachings and the principles of the Buddha. Now, there are also 2 extra things we can look at. Karuna, which is an action taken to diminish the suffering of others. This can be translated as compassion. And metta. This is meditation focused on developing unconditional love for all living things. We also have karma, this intentional action, this causality. Now, if we look at karma, we can look at it in one of 2 different ways. Let's take illness for an example. If you look at the illness from the point of view of karma, but say that the illness was not the cause or the end result of karma, that it is just its own independent being, then intervening in that illness is perfectly fine. It's the compassionate thing to do because the illness is morally neutral. However, if you look at it from a point of view of causality, that the karma, the illness is a result of that bad karma, then you are interfering with karma, and therefore any intervention in that illness, that deserved illness, is again bad karma. However, nearly every Buddhist would choose to support actions which will reduce the suffering of self and others. So what about somatic cell therapy when it comes to Buddhism? Well, most Buddhists are concerned with the relief of suffering. Tibetan Buddhists, for example, are taught that the purpose of being born as a human being is to eliminate the sufferings of others and to bring them happiness. So, if we look at it from that point of view, and we also look at karma, karma states that all our actions have consequences. So trying to cure an illness and relieve suffering will lead to positive consequences. Ignoring those who suffer will lead to negative consequences. We also have the idea of karuna, active compassionately towards other people, and healing someone of a disease or a condition will allow them to ultimately reach enlightenment. The arguments against somatic cell therapy in Buddhism could be that the illness or disease is a form of dukkha in itself. It is a form of suffering. It is a deserved suffering brought about by karma from a previous life or previous action, and it is up to the person who is suffering to work their way through it by practicing and concentrating on their religion. Germline therapy. So how do Buddhists respond to germline therapy? Well, the arguments for germline therapy in Buddhism could be that it is a relief of suffering. It should ensure that future generations, of course, do not suffer from genetic conditions. This is, of course, a good thing. The argument against all depends on if there are no negative future consequences. If there are negative future consequences, then this is where the arguments against come from. So if someone is harmed in the future, that goes against the concept of ahimsa, the avoiding harm of all living things, and it is not a right action from the Noble Eightfold Path. And then of course we have dukkha, which could indicate that this is a deserved suffering through karma. Arguments for and against saviour siblings within Buddhism. Well, arguments for depend upon karuna and metta and karma. So this is the idea of diminishing suffering, concentrating on the unconditional love of human beings and all life. And of course, the positive karma will come from positive actions. There's also the theory of dana, and dana is the idea of generosity. Generosity increases positive karma. And of course, save your siblings is the ultimate act of generosity, whether or not that actual child knows it. Arguments against come from the point of view that Buddhists believe from the moment of conception, the embryo is imbued with a sense of human consciousness. So it could be stated that those embryos that are disposed of, that don't match the correct tissue type, that is where we get our arguments against, because those embryos have human consciousness. Now, there are also risks associated with the process, and it could be going against right action and ahimsa if harm was to come to the saviour sibling. What about designer babies in Buddhism? Well, designer babies in Buddhism, if it's purely for the purpose of the relief of suffering, then Buddhists could argue for, using the arguments that we've looked at before. However, many of the arguments within Buddhism could be against designer babies if, as was previously stated, there is harm to the embryos, or if it is purely from a cosmetic point of view. Buddhists teach that all life should be valued. Okay, embryology in Buddhism. Arguments for are similar to the ones that we had before. We can look at positive karma, we can look at the idea that we're trying to find cures, so this is a compassionate thing. The arguments against will again come from the wasted embryos and the harm that might befall them. So again, Buddhists believe that human characteristics are innate within an embryo from conception. So harm to these is harming human life. This goes against the first precept and it goes against the second precept. And the second precept it goes against because it's taking something that is not freely given.